There are reports of an epidemic, a plague if you will, concerning populace deep in the bayou. I'll refer to this as a flagrant speculation. The people affected by this are no doubt of a low creed. Claiming such a thing as an epidemic is therefore not but a misinterpretation of their natural state. This being the case, calls to close the New Orleans port will go unheard. Good, God-fearing folk have my assurance that there is nothing to fear. Signed, Governor Murphy J. Foster.
Speculations on what happened in the countryside bayous of Louisiana back in the end of the 19th century are many, varied, and conflicting to say the least. Rumors upon rumors spread throughout the state, where outlandish reports suggested that collective madness drove the population insane. As the rumors began to spread like wildfire, pressure on the local politicians to intervene began to mount. But instead of intervention, the situation was downplayed, suggesting that it was nothing but lies and misinformation from the poor. However, as eyewitness reports and personal testimonies began surfacing from within the bayous, it immediately became apparent that something much more sinister was occurring within the swamps. Something even the worst of nightmares couldn't have prepared anyone for. When unexplainable deaths suddenly began occurring within the bayous of Louisiana, what started out as fear for the return of a deadly disease, the so-called yellow fever, a disease that had been absent in New Orleans for almost 20 years and was alleged to have claimed the lives of over 100 within the span of a few months. It only seemed that a logical conclusion could be drawn to the current state of affairs. But as the number of casualties continued climbing, it didn't take long before the population feared that it wasn't the yellow fever at all, but rather the outbreak of a new plague, the start of a new epidemic. Governor Murphy J. Foster, the residing governor at the time, dismissed these fears and speculations with a cold ruthlessness, stating that the deaths and diseases were nothing but the natural state of the poor and uneducated population residing within the bayous. And because of this, the notion to close the New Orleans harbor was dismissed, and international access to Louisiana remained a possibility. As people continued to perish within the bayous, the disease that was silently killing off the population would soon become the lesser evil, as the body of the deceased would no longer remain dead, but would instead rise from their graves as simple-minded, raging fiends with nothing but the desire to consume the living. These walking abominations would be referred to as grunts, and seemed to define mankind's understanding of natural science and biology. How they could move with torn limbs and severed muscle fibers, let alone function with their internal organs rotting, seemed incomprehensible to the local doctors and researchers who began to study them. Within these grunts, flowing through their entire bodies, a black substance, almost as thick as tar, was found, and was initially suspected to be the driving force behind the grunts. It was slowly becoming abundantly clear that this wasn't a regular epidemic. It was something far more wicked. But the question on everyone's mind, where it had come from and how, was still shrouded in mystery. But the grunts were only the beginning. No person could have predicted just how grim of a turn the situation was about to take. Within weeks of the initial rise of the dead, virgin pregnancies began occurring among the local female population, the youngest documented pregnancy being as early as 13 years of age. And while doctors would reject the notion of this being humanly possible, the medical professionals within Louisiana would soon realize that they weren't dealing with anything human anymore. As the fetus of a young girl was removed from her surgically, the girl herself, upon seeing the fetus, described it as being a hard and dead piece of chewed up wood, and definitely not something human. Luckily for this particular female, the procedure had, unbeknownst to herself and everyone else, saved her from a fate far worse than death. This point in the Louisiana timeline would mark the inception of the so-called hives and the end of hope for any woman within the bayous. spawned through virgin pregnancy, which every woman within the infected region of Louisiana could be subject to. These ungodly abominations would gestate within their hosts, forming hard, wooden-like beehives, before emerging from within, bursting through the victim's ribcage, tearing apart its host in the process. The disfigurement would reveal a bee-like hive residing within the victim. The hive would emerge with a force so powerful that it would break the victim's spine in half, leaving the upper body hanging down the host's side, forcing its victim to persist in a mangled state of ceaseless agony. These hives and the bees, flies, moths, and other insects contained within it would all serve as the carriers for the corruption, spreading it from victim to victim, increasing the number of infected within the population. These infected, who would eventually die from the exposure to the corruption, would then inevitably turn into grunts, further adding to the horrors of this atrocious nightmare that was now unfolding. Panic and chaos ignited like wildfire. People fled their homes trying to escape this evil that had befallen them. The ones that either couldn't or didn't make it out confined themselves to their homes, barricading their shelters and houses to the best of their ability, hoping to ward off these monstrous atrocities ravaging through the swamps. These attempts at survival would prove futile, as even the slightest bite, scratch, or contact with another person infected with the corruption would lead to one's demise. One by one, the surviving population crumbled from within, as friends became enemies and family members turned on each other, either because of the spread of the infection or simply because of the fear of potential infection. Slowly, the bayous turned into an occult cesspool of the dead, the soon-to-be dead, and the ever-increasing presence of demonic abominations, each more terrifying than the other. While these events were kept secret from the rest of the world, and the deaths within the bayous were publicly explained as the regular state of the poor, researchers who ventured into the bayous would manage to bring out reports and sightings of the horror within the area. This caught the attention of a single man, Dr. Philip Huff Jones, who upon seeing these reports seemed to have an understanding of what was happening. As the director of the American Hunters Association, the AHA, an organization of bounty hunters who for hundreds of years had been hunting the wicked and occult for the greater good of mankind, he was certain this was the doing of a so-called sculptor, an otherworldly entity who had somehow managed to transcend to our world from another plane and unleashed its horror upon mankind. The terminology documented and used by Dr. Jones alone suggests that this wasn't the first time that the AHA had been involved in an event similar to what happened in Louisiana, but when and where these other events might have taken place is purely left to speculation. In an attempt to contain the spread of corruption, Dr. Jones established the so-called hunting grounds, opening up the area of Louisiana to any member of the AHA, in the hopes that the prospect of hunting both monsters and humans alike, the hunters of the AHA would rid or at least contain the source of infection to the bayous until Dr. Jones himself could figure out a plan to remove the sculptor from the realm. That was the plan, at least. However, while Dr. Jones' original intentions were to remove the sculptor from Louisiana, this idea didn't sit well with everyone. A lot of people, both within and outside of the AHA, had come to enjoy the rewards they could reap within the bayous, the fame that came with being a triumphant hunter, as well as the rush of adrenaline that came from hunting these wicked creatures and the other hunters within. Taking this into account, Dr. Jones' lack of better judgment led him to divide his attention between managing the AHA and overseeing his own experiments in his asylum, putting other less suited people in charge of the bureaucratic decisions within the AHA. This led to corruption and internal power struggles in the organization, which quickly rippled out negatively among the hunters. The decline of the AHA would essentially lead to a disgruntled member of the organization killing Dr. Jones, in the hopes that this would crumble the AHA entirely from within. With the death of Dr. Jones, the structured organization of bounty hunting within the Louisiana collapsed. Smaller splinter organizations formed, and this led to a situation where smaller factions and independent hunters opposed each other in endless expeditions within the hunting grounds of Louisiana, completing contracts for monetary gains by collecting bounties for wealthier people who hoped to catch a glimpse of the horrors contained within the bayous, where the alleged presence of the sculptor had corrupted the area to such a degree that no living thing could survive for more than 60 minutes without succumbing to the evil within. This being said, While theories, speculations, and hypotheses about what the actual cause of the Louisiana events are, if the sculpture even exists, if it's a physical manifestation of hell on earth, or something completely different, the dead ends and unsolved mysteries leaves us with nothing but questions. Questions we might never get answers to. Hey there, Hazmat here. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoy this type of content and would like to see more, please let me know in the comments below. Big shout out to Evil Roy, Tip, Claire and Leon, and Mass, as well as Hyde. Thank you guys for your contributions. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.